Hello, and welcome to the Social Protection Podcast. I'm your host, Jo Sharp. This month, in partnership with Australia's Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, we are continuing our special series on social inclusion. Over 3 episodes, we'll be exploring how social protection systems can advance the economic and social inclusion of vulnerable populations across the Indo-Pacific. We'll be addressing key themes like gender equality, demographic shifts, and disability inclusion. The Asia-Pacific region is undergoing significant demographic transformation as populations begin to age in many countries. Preparing for ageing means investment over the life course, in individual savings, pensions, in health and care, and in work. And at the centre of these shifts lies the care economy, the health and social services that sustain societies but have long relied on women's unpaid labour. While traditional family-based care is coming under pressure due to some of those demographic as well as social and economic shifts. With me today to talk about these dynamics and how governments and societies can prepare as populations age, I have Philip O'Keefe, development economist and professor of practice at the University of New South Wales Centre for Population Ageing Research, Jessie Doyle, senior social protection specialist at Partnerships for Social Protection, and Rosia B., who is national coordinator for social protection reforms at the Ministry of Women, Children and Social Protection in Fiji. Welcome, Philip, Jessie and Rosia.
Thanks, Jo. Great to be on the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Bula from Fiji. Thank you for having me.
Philip, they say that demographics are destiny, so let's start by talking about demographic trends in Asia and the Pacific, beginning with Asia. What makes Asia's ageing populations distinctive compared to other regions?
Let me first comment on the demographics, the destiny point. It's very true. At one level, they influence, they shape the economic and social destinies of countries very much. At the same time, they're not set in stone. So there's a big role for policy and behavioural change in how societies react and adapt to their demographics. As far as Asia goes, if you compare to countries that are older and richer currently, there are probably 3 or 4 things that are distinctive. The first is the speed of this ageing transition. The transition from ageing to aged societies that took between 50 and 120 years in OECD countries, so 2 to 4 generations, is taking between 18 and 25 years in East and Southeast Asia in particular. So we're looking at 1 generation only for that rapid transition. Second is that this is happening at much lower income levels, this ageing transition, than it did in OECD countries. So it's this phenomenon they talk about of getting old before getting rich. The third is, and it's at the margin a bit more, but it is the emergence in some countries, and I'm thinking Singapore, Korea, China, of extremely low fertility. Women having 1 or fewer, in the case of Korea, children across their lives. So that's important also. A fourth, I think, for some countries, again, some but not others in Asia, is that they have very low inward migration. That would be true for China, for Korea, Japan, Vietnam and others. But that's important too in how societies adapt to ageing.
Jessie, coming to the Pacific next. How does the Pacific compare and what are the trends in Pacific Island countries?
Thanks, Jo. I'd say the Pacific countries sit quite apart from Asia when it comes to their demographics. The ageing transition for the Pacific has been more gradual, when it's also been delayed compared to most Asian countries. But I'd also say it's really challenging to paint a demographic narrative for the region with the same brush because there's quite a bit of variation across and even within the sub-regions. So the Polynesian countries are by far the most advanced in the ageing transition. Cook Islands and Niue are the only 2 countries in the region with elderly shares above 10% of the population. Part of the story in Polynesia is lower fertility rates, but the other part is high rates of outward migration, which creates an artificially aged population, not because of a natural demographic transition, but largely because the working age populations are leaving for work in Australia and New Zealand. The Melanesian countries are the least advanced in the ageing transition. So all of the Melanesian countries, apart from Fiji, have shares of elderly below 7% of the population. And PNG and Solomon Islands in particular have fertility rates that are really high. The dominant demographic trend in these countries is that of a youth bulge, with significant shares of the population falling into that youth grouping and challenges with being able to generate enough employment opportunities to absorb the number of youth entering the workforce each year. Then you have the Micronesian countries, which are sitting somewhere in the middle. So Nauru and Palau are at an early stage of the aging transition. So it's a bit of a patchwork, but most Pacific countries are at the opposite end of the demographic transition to many of the Asian countries. The priority is often focusing on investments in education and skills to capture that demographic dividend before that window closes, more so than it is on investing in robust aged care systems. But having said that, I think it is also worth noting that the Pacific countries have still done a remarkable job of investing and setting up old age pension programs. And the other point to flag is outside of these government-led programs, they obviously have these incredibly strong systems of support for the elderly, which come in the form of these communal safety nets, which are referred to, as the Wontok system in PNG and by other names in other countries.
Rosia, Fiji's population is young compared to some of the Asian countries we've just discussed, but the proportion of older people is rising. What demographic shifts are underway in Fiji, and what are the effects on people and society?
By global standards, yes, Fiji's population is relatively young, but it is gradually aging. There are a number of factors that characterizes this shift, such as persistent rural urban migration, high labor mobility, gender and social disparities, and emerging public health and environmental challenges. Since year 2000, the proportion of people aged 60 and over has gradually increased, reaching about 10% of the population since 2023. And that figure is projected to rise to around 15% by 2050. Women make up the majority of this older population. So these demographic trends actually means that the risks that people face in old age are becoming more widespread and more visible. And as this group grows, the old age dependency ratio is also expected to rise. And this pressure gets further intensified by out-migration as more working group people leave for work overseas. And at the same time, the traditional family and community support systems, which people have been relying for long, looking at it as an important safety net for many people in Fiji, that also gets under strain from a number of factors, not only climate or economic shocks, but also the rising cost of living. And further to this out-migration is often male-dominated, and this results in increased responsibility for women in the households. There are emerging social problems and disruption to family life and communal obligations in villages and communities. So for the vulnerable groups, government support becomes increasingly important. And in this context, Ministry of Women, Children and Social Protection play a critical role in complementing community care and helping protect people as they face this heightened risk in later life, especially through the delivery of these social protection programs. The government is able to support them. Fiji also has an established National Council for Older Persons that is the lead coordinating body responsible to oversee the alignment to the national aging policy. Currently, this is under review, the national aging policy, and we are looking forward to the findings from this extensive consultation.
Jessie, we're going to talk in this episode more about the ageing side of things. And as you say, Pacific countries have, in many cases, prioritised social protection systems for their ageing populations. What are the challenges that countries grapple with as societies begin to age?
I do just want to flag up front that demographic aging is at its core a success story. It means people are living longer, which is often a reflection of stronger public health systems, better nutrition outcomes, and also often periods of peace. And so countries that are aging are, in an important sense, countries that have done something right along the way. So the challenge isn't necessarily that people are living longer, but rather that the systems and programs need to catch up and support them to live with dignity. But having said that, the challenges this country face with building these systems are genuine and they shouldn't be minimized. And there are maybe just a few sort of pressures that immediately come to mind. The first one is around providing financial security to the elderly. So as the ratio of older people to working age adults rises, that intergenerational contract, which is often one of workers funding retirees, can come under strain, as the working age population isn't necessarily able to support the elderly in the same way that maybe they once were. And in the Pacific, the systems for providing financial security in old age often revolve around provident funds or social security funds for formal sector workers, and then universal social pensions as well. And these social pensions are financed through government revenue, often tax revenue, and end up doing quite a bit of the heavy lifting in terms of providing financial security in old age. And given their universal programs, the coverage rates are obviously extremely high, but the challenge is often around benefit adequacy. Another major challenge is around public health and care systems. So as populations age, they face health issues and use health services in more complex ways. If we think about health utilization rates, these rise with age across almost every category of care. And where those systems don't exist, the gaps obviously don't go unfilled. It's often filled informally and overwhelmingly by women who absorb unpaid care work at much higher rates than men. I think there's also a workforce dimension on the supply side of health systems. So often the pipeline of health workers isn't able to keep pace with the demand growth that an older population creates. And in the Pacific, this is also compounded by outward migration of trained health workers who often leave for better paid positions in Australia and New Zealand.
So, Pip, how should people and governments be preparing for societal ageing?
The first thing to say would be that ageing, if you're going to navigate it as a society, as a government, is not just about old people, but all people. So it's a life course issue. And it's pretty common sense, really. If you're thinking about financially secure old age, it involves savings and investment across the life course. It's the health behaviours, the risks, etc., that determine your mortality and morbidity patterns in old age that you've done from the younger stages, even from before birth. We know, for example, that the nutrition of children in the womb and in early years is one of the key determinants of how many non-communicable diseases they have later in life. And similarly with productivity, you can't suddenly hope to make people productive at age 60 or 65 if you haven't, set the foundations for human capital and the like. The second is that I think governments often fail to anticipate fairly predictable demographic change. They have policy settings that are based on current demographics and not emerging and future demographics. But you know what those demographics are going to be already, because most of those people are born. So plan around that and look ahead. The third would be, I think, that often the aging issue and older people are characterized as a homogenous group. And in fact, they're a very diverse group, as you would expect. They're diverse by gender, they're diverse by socioeconomic status, formality status, disability status. At the simplest level, they're diverse by their mortality status. Poorer people die younger. So when you're thinking about policies, they also have to be sufficiently flexible and sufficiently customized or nuanced anyway to reflect that diversity. The fourth thing is that if we look at inequality in societies in Asia, it's highest amongst older groups. That's true in Vietnam, it's true in India, it's true in Malaysia for the countries we've looked at. That's quite a different picture to the OECD. If you look at New Zealand, for example, people over 65 are the most equal cohort amongst themselves. And that's because of social security systems and the effect they have. So where you have underdeveloped social security systems, inequality is highly likely to be highest at older stages. So that's a really important factor to keep in mind too.
Rosia, you started to talk about social protection schemes in Fiji, and you mentioned that with these changing societal shifts, support from government for people in old age is becoming more important. Can you tell us a little bit about what Fiji has in place in terms of pension schemes and programs for seniors?
So Fiji adopts a life cycle approach to social protection, which includes supporting income security and well-being of vulnerable groups from children, women, persons with disability, and also including the older persons. And Fiji's system is built on a combination of contributory and non-contributory programs so that support is available regardless of someone's work history. So on the contributory side, the cornerstone is Fiji's National Provident Fund, or FNPF. It is a defined contribution scheme with a mandatory contribution rate of 18%. So 10% is paid by employers and 8% by employees. And in one of the publications that I read, it said as of mid-2025, FNPF had served over 423,000 total members, and approximately 264,000 were active contributors who had made at least one payment during the financial year. And that plays a key role in supporting retirement income for those who have been, able to participate in formal labor market. So alongside FNPF, there are additional contributory arrangements, such as the government pension, which some people also know as a civil servants pension, the aftercare funds, which support specific group of retirees. But at the same time, government recognizes that not everyone has the opportunity to contribute consistently to the superannuation scheme. And for this reason, Fiji places a very strong emphasis on its non-contributory support. So particularly the social pension scheme, or SPS. So this scheme is a monthly cash benefit to older persons. It's age and pension tested, so it's 65 and above age. And, if people are not receiving any other forms of superannuation. So today, this scheme is reaching around 58,000 people who are 65 and above, as I mentioned earlier. And this represents approximately 94% of Fiji's older population. So importantly, this coverage has expanded progressively over time, with the number of beneficiaries more than doubling since 2016. This growth reflects government's ongoing commitment to strengthening support for older persons. And in addition to this social pension scheme, it is also complemented by a range of additional measures, that is support for well-being of older persons. There is also a transport assistance scheme that subsidizes the transport cost and ensures greater social inclusion, access to services. Ministry of Health is also working with free medicine scheme for social welfare beneficiaries. We also have residential care homes through Golden Age Homes, which is also the state homes for older people with higher care needs. These assistive devices that is provided to the elderly persons with disabilities, and services that, provide support and advice to cases of elder abuse.
Pip, as you were saying, demographics and ageing, these trends are foreseeable, predictable, they come on slowly. So how well are pension and social protection systems, social security systems in Asia able to prepare for these shifts, especially in some of those countries that you mentioned where ageing is really starting to occur rapidly?
I'd say it's a mixed bag. Let me first start by saying the thing that shapes what you can do, or your options and possibilities for pension systems, is very much the labour market. And across Asia, emerging Asia, informality in the labour market is the key determinant of what your options are for pension systems. Across this emerging region, maybe 3/4 of workers, up to 90% in countries like Cambodia and Laos, are still in the informal sector. And that really constrains what you can do in certain parts of the pension system. As a result, across nearly the whole region, I would say, the contributory pension systems, which rely largely on formal workers and public sector workers, have low coverage. Anywhere, from less than 10% in some countries to maybe 1/4 of workers in countries like Vietnam, Thailand, a little bit higher, 40% in Malaysia, closer to 50% in China, but it never gets more than half. So contributory pension system coverage is low, and progress in expanding coverage has been fairly slow also. So the hope we all had that things would formalise, coverage would expand quickly, that's not happening, and I think it's unlikely to happen quickly. The kind of related response there has been that a number of countries have introduced schemes specifically for the informal sector, contributory schemes, often with a match from government. So they might match a contribution 1-to-1 or in some proportion. And that's happened in Vietnam, in Thailand, Malaysia, China, India. And that's useful. And some of those schemes have got some success. India's got 80 million people in one of its informal schemes. But it goes nowhere near covering the coverage gap of the contributory system. So they're a nice supplement, but they're not the solution to that low coverage problem. As a result, social pensions, non-contributory pensions, have proliferated across the region. As Jessie mentioned, in a number of the PICs, they are universal for people over a certain age. In the Asian countries, they tend to be targeted, in some cases very broadly. So Thailand is almost universal, pension tested. Malaysia, in contrast, only has 4% of older people covered by the social pension. However, again, with the exception of some of the Pacific Island countries, the adequacy of those social pensions tends to be very low.
Rosia, Fiji's expansion of pension coverage has, of course, translated into more investment. So over time, as a percentage of GDP, investment in pensions and that kind of support has grown from less than 0.4% in 2017 to 1.12%, I think, this year. There are always fiscal challenges and budgetary trade-offs with social protection schemes needing to be considered alongside all sorts of other government spending. How is it that the government of Fiji has been able to prioritise and achieve this expansion?
I wouldn't say it's about a big policy shift. It's really been a gradual expansion over time, as I mentioned earlier. So what we've seen is a growing understanding that pensions are not just about retirement savings, but about people's right to be protected when they become more vulnerable later in life. As Fiji's population ages and as families' support system come under pressure, this has become much clearer. So the scheme has progressively expanded its reach by lowering the eligibility age and increasing monthly payouts through successive national budgets. It started in 2013 with the age of 70 and allowance that time was $30 per month. And over the years, the age was lowered to 68, then to 66 and 65 now, with a maximum allowance of $157 per month, which includes the transport assistance scheme as well. So the age threshold lowered over time, but the benefit value increased. And noting the significant impact of this social assistance program, including the SPS on the target groups, government continues to invest and prioritize the support to the vulnerable group. Another important factor is that social pension has proven to be very strong and reliable platform during crisis. And we saw this during cyclones and during COVID response with the cost of living pressures. Since the platform was already available, existing social protection program was used to reach these older people and their households directly. And it has been an effective way to deliver timely support when shocks hit.
Thank you. And having started to talk about the financial or fiscal aspects, Jessie, how can governments think about providing adequate social protection in old age in a way that is fiscally sustainable, affordable, and that they're prepared to invest in?
I think providing financial security in old age has always been a challenge for governments, and no single pension program can do everything when it comes to providing protection, but I think each does have a distinct role. And the challenge is often in providing a combination of those schemes that can deliver sort of adequate protection in a way that's suited to a given country context. So just in terms of how you pull together these pillars of a pension system to provide protection in a way that's fiscally sustainable, it's obviously going to vary from country to country, but I think a few useful rules hold, and these are more geared towards the Pacific, which is where the work of P4SP is concentrated. Firstly, you want to start small and gradually increase coverage rates in a fiscally measured way. So most of the Pacific countries started with a provident fund for formal sector workers, then introduced the social pension layer much later and set the cutoff age relatively high and the benefit levels on the lower side before adjusting these to become more generous over time. Ideally, you want to index benefits for social pensions so that they're not eroding in real terms, and potentially even consider a tiered benefit level based on needs and also introducing a pension testing requirement. I'd say you want to close coverage gaps on the contributory side where possible, and a simple way to do that is bringing in some of those groups I mentioned that might otherwise be excluded by design. You also want to tighten up some of the design rules for the contributory scheme. So adjusting contribution rates, reviewing investment rules, and then also aiming to prevent some of the early withdrawal leakage, which can be a problem for the provident funds, particularly where they're allowing drawdowns in the wake of natural disasters and other types of shocks. And then finally, I think you really want to open up those windows for contributions from informal workers for the provident funds and other contributory schemes in Asian countries, but noting that they will, obviously serve as a complement to and not as a substitute for a broader base social pension.
Rosia, you've talked a bit about the vulnerability that can come with old age. I'm interested in the impact of pensions coverage in Fiji on things like poverty rates and the lives of elderly people receiving those pensions.
So the pension coverage in Fiji, particularly through the SPS, has had a meaningful impact. So from a poverty perspective, the evidence is very clear. The analysis of the national data shows that existing social protection programs, especially the SPS, has had significant impact on reducing poverty amongst this older group. But beyond poverty metrics, the real impact is what it means for the people's lives. A recent review conducted by the Ministry's Poverty Monitoring Unit, which interviewed over 1,300 social pension recipients across Fiji, demonstrated that. So one of the findings was more than 50% of these recipients are actually the sole income earners in their households. So that pension isn't just supporting older people, it's helping sustain entire families as a critical income support. This pension is also making a practical difference to the standard of living for Fiji's older persons as well. Recipients reported being able to move into more private, secure housing, improve sanitation, gain access to more reliable water sources. And the survey that I've been talking about also showed that most of the monthly allowance goes towards essential household needs, healthcare, and fulfilling social responsibilities. Things like contributing to family obligation and community life. They can participate in events, celebrations, and things as well. That tells us that pension is used to help people live with dignity and remain active, respected members of the families and communities as well. We also see a strong impact from the transport assistance top up, the existing welfare allowance that they get. The beneficiaries 70 years and above, so they get a top up of $26 to their existing benefit. And this is also given to the persons with disability as well. So this actually provides them with flexibility on how the cash can be used, especially for those who are living in remote or maritime, and they rely on boats or taxis or even carriers. So for many older people, especially those who face mobility challenges or high travel cost, this support makes it easier to access services, even social and community activities. So that connection is just as important as income, and it supports their independence, the social inclusion, and quality of life.
Pip, we've already started to talk a little bit about care, which obviously is a really important facet of ageing. And of course, who does the care work for elderly people, but also children and people with disabilities. As we know, as Jessie mentioned, the lion's share of that often falls to women or girls in the family. But to connect it back to some of your earlier points about the importance of being able to contribute to savings or contributory pensions and those sorts of things through the life course, obviously caring responsibilities take people out of the workforce, and so you end up with a sort of whole range of nested issues. How are Southeast Asian countries grappling with those related issues of women taking on the bulk of caring responsibilities, that low workforce participation? You also talked about high rates of informality in general, and of course the lack of savings or contributions to pensions when they reach old age themselves.
I think just to put some numbers around those challenges, between 75 and 90% of the informal care is provided by women in the region, the unpaid care. And 90 to 95% of all the care is informal. So, as you said, it's overwhelmingly women. In terms of how that affects labour force participation, it's interesting because you do get quite a bit of variation in female labour force participation in this region. The communist countries broadly tend to have higher participation, and that's common in other regions with a communist heritage. Others, the directions of change are a little bit different. Malaysia, for example, has increased female labour force participation by 15 percentage points in the last decade or so, whereas Indonesia has remained really flat. Thailand's declined a bit. But whatever the story is, where women are working, it doesn't seem to lower the care burden on them. Even where women are participating more, men are not participating more on the home front, let's say. So that's important. And then, as you said, on the pension side, because women are less likely to be working, B, working in the formal sector when they are working, and C, even if they're in the formal sector, have lower wages and more career breaks, they have less coverage of pensions and less adequate pensions even when they come. So then if you look at what governments are doing on care to try and square the circle a little bit in this story, if you look at aged care first, I think all of Southeast Asia and China in particular have recognised this challenge, the need to develop formal care systems to kind of complement informal care. But I'd say nearly all the systems are very nascent. So most of them lack a clear national policy framework. They have fragmented governance. They spend very, very little on formal care systems, although there are a lot of care costs hidden in health spending because their bed blocking and other things for things that should be aged care are kind of getting picked up by long stays in the hospital system. They all, in their initial policies, emphasised home and community-based care as the foundation of what they would like a future formal system to be, and see an important role for communities, in a number of cases, primary healthcare systems as a kind of hub for where care can proceed from. And you've got some nice examples. Thailand, for example, in its universal health package, has introduced a long-term care window for home-based care. It's a kind of capitated scheme. China has introduced long-term care insurance, national pilots covering populations with hundreds of millions of people. So things are starting. I think momentum is there, but it's very early days in the aged care space, and the vast majority remains informal.
Rosia, you've talked already a bit about the pressure that sort of traditional community and family care systems have come under with some of these demographic shifts, including outmigration. Can you tell me a little bit more about those effects in Fiji? And I'm interested in how the government works to support families and elderly people with these kinds of government transfers in a way that is still consistent with or supportive of those traditional care-based systems. If you've recently gone through a process of consultation, I imagine this was perhaps a key theme that came up.
Thank you. A great question. So in Fiji, family-based care continues to be the primary source of support for older persons. And that remains strongly rooted in our shared values of respect for elders, the family responsibilities, and community care. So traditionally, Fiji has relied heavily on extended family systems to care for elderly. However, this model is under strain, like we had discussed earlier, so due to urban migration, overseas employment, or rising cost of living, even changing social norms, and now people want to maintain smaller households. So as a result, more elderly people are living alone or with limited support, I would say. So increased financial pressure on working age family members to support them as well, or reduce capacity for full-time caregiving, I'd say. So like many countries, Fiji is also experiencing these social and economic changes that are influencing how families can provide this care. So it is evident that families are supporting older relatives in different ways, sometimes across households or locations, rather than family care disappearing altogether. So during this policy review, they had also come up with, these kind of issues that were raised during these consultations as well. So one thing was evident that they did say, the family care is not totally disappearing. It is there, but I think that needs to be strengthened. So the government's role is to support and strengthen families in this caregiving role. In terms of like programs such as social pension scheme provides a basic and reliable income for older persons. It helps them to reduce the financial pressure on households and also provides older persons with autonomy within the household. Other support services such as the transport assistance that I've talked about and the free medicine scheme that makes it easier for older persons to remain independent, healthy and engaged in the community. And for older persons with higher care needs and limited family support, government also provides the residential care through the Golden Age Home or the State Home. Following careful assessments for sure, because these services are designed to complement family and community support and fill in the gaps for those who don't have access to adequate support, but for sure not to replace it. So we work in partnership with families, we work with the faith-based organizations, the non-government organizations, civil societies to ensure that care is culturally appropriate and dignified. The overall focus is on promoting dignity, inclusion, and shared responsibility for our older families within the families and communities.
Jessie, as Rosia described earlier, Pacific Island countries are subject to a lot of disasters. Those are becoming more frequent, more severe with climate change. Of course, Pacific Island countries, like many economies, were also heavily impacted by COVID some years back. What role can pension systems, as part of broader social protection systems, play in responding to these kinds of shocks?
Yeah, I think it's a really pertinent question for many of the Pacific countries because they are amongst the most shock-exposed countries globally. There's obviously been a massive push towards adaptive and shock-responsive social protection over the past decade around the world, and the Pacific countries have actually been leading some of that thinking. The pension system itself is a common pillar across all Pacific countries, so it's often the first port of call in terms of shock response in the region. And with the exception of a few countries, most Pacific countries have their pension systems built around a contributory provident fund, mostly for formal sector workers, and then a government-financed social pension scheme, which is universal above a certain age cutoff. And so for the provident funds, they're increasingly being used as a pool of savings, which can help cushion the financial hit of natural disasters and do so in a way that's actually drawing down on the limited fiscal space which governments in the region face. So it's not drawing from government revenues, which is seen as a plus. The Vanuatu National Provident Fund was one of the first provident funds to trial this approach in the wake of Tropical Cyclone Pam back in 2015, and they've committed members to withdraw up to 20% of the value of their retirement accounts. And since then, these types of early withdrawal rules have become fairly standardized across the provident funds in the region, including accommodating withdrawals for other types of shocks as well. The other way that pension systems have been used for shock response more recently is through the universal social pensions. And in this case, it's the governments providing the financing for top-up transfers for existing beneficiaries, sometimes through budget support from development partners as well. And most Pacific countries use their social pensions as a response to the COVID-19 pandemic as well. So I'd say, both pillars of these pension systems have been really useful as a vehicle for shock response. They definitely permit a quick cash response, which can help households get back on their feet and provide a bit of a macroeconomic buffer as well. I'd also just say that with the provident funds, whilst it's an easy response, there are some limitations as well. One is just in terms of coverage. Obviously, the funds are mostly focusing on formal sector workers, so that means you're often missing the most vulnerable populations in terms of the response. And then the other is that there's a clear trade-off in terms of the withdrawals providing short-term relief, but also eroding the retirement adequacy for workers. And I'd say this concern is probably more acute in the Pacific too, just because there are major shocks that are hitting some of these countries every 2 to 3 years rather than over longer intervals. So overall, pension systems have a really important role to play in shock response, but there are also risks that need to be considered and thoughtfully managed.
Philip O'Keefe, Jessie Doyle and Rosia B., thank you so much for joining me on the Social Protection podcast today.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks for having us, Joe.
Thank you for giving me the opportunity to share Fiji's experience.
Before we go, we like to end each episode with some quick wins. We ask a guest to bring in some recommendations for research, news or events that have sparked their interest and that we think you should know more about. Joining us for Quick Wins today is Dr. Meghna Ranganathan. Meghna is Associate Professor at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine and a member of the Cash Transfer and Intimate Partner Violence Research Collaborative. Welcome, Meghna.
Thank you very much, Joe, for having me, and thank you, sp.org.
The first resource we're going to discuss comes out of the Cash and IPV Research Collaborative, titled Evolution of Intimate Partner Violence, Impact from Cash Transfers, Food Transfers and Behaviour Change Communication. That's looking at impacts 9 years after an initial intervention in Bangladesh. And as we've discussed on this podcast before, the impact of social protection and cash transfers on gender-based violence and women's empowerment is a growing area of research. So I'm particularly interested in what this longer-term view reveals. So in a nutshell, how did those impacts evolve over time?
Thank you, Joe. So if I had to really sum up this paper in a nutshell, I'd say this. It's not just asking whether cash or food transfers, when they're coupled with plus components or complementary programming, such as behavior change and communication, or otherwise known as BCC, reduces intimate partner violence. It's really asking how those impacts change over time. And so that's where I think it gets really interesting, because during the program itself, the effects are quite broad. Households have more resources, stress levels are down. That seems to translate into fewer conflicts. At the same time, especially when the transfers are combined with the BCC, you start to see shifts in relationships. Women report better communication with their husbands, more respect. There are fewer arguments. So early on, multiple things are working together, and there is relief from that economic stress. There are improvements in emotional well-being. There are some shifts in gender dynamics, such as women feeling valued or appreciated. And so there's improvements in their decision-making power. But then when you move just beyond the program, so about a month to 4 years later, you see a narrowing of some of these effects. But the strongest and the most consistent reductions in violence are in the groups that had both cash and BCC. And that suggests that those plus components really matter in the short term because they help reshape how couples interact, not just in their financial situation. But now here's the key part. Fast forward nearly a decade and the story changes again. Most of those relational and empowerment effects start to fade. And what's left is really a sustained reduction in violence because of economic security. So in the places where households are able to turn those transfers into something lasting, like assets or more stable livelihoods, you still see lower levels of violence. And where that didn't happen, the impacts disappear or even reverse. And so this is where I think the paper has a really important implication for policy, especially for governments, because sustainability isn't just about whether a program continues to exist in a budget line. It's about whether the impacts themselves are sustainable after the program ends. And from a public finance perspective, governments are always balancing cost, scale, and duration. So the study suggests that the short-term or one-off interventions may not deliver lasting benefits unless they actually shift the long-term economic conditions. So the big takeaway for me is that impacts don't just fade, they evolve. And early on, it's about relationships and the behavior of people and couples. And in the long run, it's about whether the program changed the underlying economic reality of people's lives. And I think that's what raises this really important question. Are we designing programs that create temporary improvements in well-being, or ones that fundamentally shift long-term security? Because if governments and donors care about both impact and value for money over time, this paper suggests you probably need to design for durability and not just for an immediate result. And so that's really what I think is the most interesting finding or takeaway from this paper.
Yeah, at the end there, you talked about designing for durability, and that's a really interesting way of thinking about it. I think research undertaken and deployed in policymaking around social protection probably too often is often looking at those immediate impacts, during the time when the intervention is at its best, the rates of transfers are highest, with the most resources behind it to make sure the implementation goes really well. And as you say, to understand how those impacts actually change over time is absolutely fascinating to hear. Speaking of which, you were one of several authors of an article that appeared in The Lancet Global Health earlier this year on decolonising implementation science. I will say that as I was reading this article, for listeners, I needed to remind myself of my undergraduate studies and what terms like ontological and epistemological actually mean. But implementation science is the systematic study of methods used to adopt and integrate evidence-based practices, programs or policies into real-world settings. And in this field, social protection, as in many others, research is of course influential. We've seen things like RCTs and impact studies carry a lot of weight with policymakers and in the spread of ideas and knowledge globally. So I'm interested to hear from you, in a practical sense, what would decolonising or disrupting our assumptions about whose knowledge matters, what evidence is valid, what methods are considered rigorous, what might that actually look like?
I think the simplest way to really understand decolonizing implementation science is really this. It's about making research both more inclusive, more equitable, by widening what we count as good evidence and who gets to produce it. So right now, in the field of social protection, as well as in evaluation research in general, we tend to put a lot of weight on certain methods, as you just said. So especially things like RCTs or pure statistical methods to show impact. And those are really valuable, but they don't always capture everything. And so what would change in practice? First, we'd treat different types of knowledge more equitably. So not just statistics and impact evaluations, but also people's lived experiences, local knowledge, insights from practitioners. And instead of those being seen as less rigorous, they'd be taken seriously as essential evidence to answer the question, make the point. Second, we'd make the research process itself more equitable. So that means communities and local organizations aren't just participants, but they're involved from the start, helping define and shape the problem as well as the solution and decide what success looks like, which is really quite a different way of thinking about it in terms of participatory research. Third, I think one of our suggestions was rethinking what we mean by rigor in a more equitable way. So at the moment, rigor often means using certain methods. And this paper argues that it should also include prompts like, do you really understand the local context? Did you build trust? Are your findings useful to the people they're meant to actually serve? And finally, it's really about shifting power more equitably. So who gets the funding to do the research? Who leads the research? And whose voices are really recognized as expertise? So in simple terms, decolonizing isn't really about throwing out our existing methods. It's about broadening the toolkit and making the whole system fairer, more balanced, more equitable, and more grounded in real-world experience. And the key point the paper makes is that this isn't just about fairness, it actually leads to better and more relevant science.
Dr. Meghna Ranganathan, thank you so much for joining us on the Social Protection Podcast today.
Thank you, Joe. Thank you, the team. It was a real pleasure to be here.
And thank you for joining us on the Social Protection Podcast. And a special thanks again to our friends at Australia's Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade for supporting this series, and to the Partnerships for Social Protection program for helping us to shape this episode and connect us to guests. Join us for the next episode on integrating social protection services and supports to help people with disabilities realise their rights and potential. This podcast is a production of socialprotection.org. You can find all of our episodes on the socialprotection.org website and on your favourite podcast platforms. Be sure to like, subscribe, and leave a review. Back next month. See you then.